Hello, everybody. Tonight, or this week, or whenever you're seeing this, what we're going to do is try something a little different. Um, there's going to be three separate videos and three separate self-evaluation quizzes that are available for you to watch and take. The quizzes are there to support your efforts in learning the discussions of each video. And I'm doing it in three different pieces so that we'll be able to have them short enough so that you don't have to be stuck watching it all a long time. You'll have opportunity to pause and do something different and then come back to them. So let's get started. Start from the beginning of this. There we go. Okay, so this is Chapter 6, Cost Allocation. Remember, in Chapter 5, we discussed the classifications of costs according to the relationship to volume. That's when we talked about fixed cost and variable costs. And remember, variable costs, the total variable cost increased as we had more volume, more units that were being produced. So if the variable cost of one unit was $1, and we had none, so if we had no units produced, we had no variable costs. If we had 50, we had $50, and fixed costs were steady within a relevant range. This chapter covers the relationship of cost to the subunit being analyzed. And when we talk about subunit, we mean the department that we're trying to look at and see if costs should be allocated to it. Usually some sort of service area, like the OR room or the lab department or the ER department will need indirect costs or costs allocated to it. We will see that the costs that are shared by the entire organization, called overhead or indirect costs, again, must be allocated to the patient service units that create the need for those costs. You'll see what I mean in a little bit. In addition to their relationship to volume, in Chapter 5, costs can be classified by the relationship to unit of activity. So we have direct, which are those costs unique and exclusive to a subunit. And we've got indirect, or overhead, which are those costs associated with shared resources used by the entire organization. The purpose of cost allocation is to assign indirect costs to subunits. So when we talk about that again, let's just see if we can say that in a little different terms. When you have a department like the accounting department or the billing department, the admin department, those costs need to be somehow allocated to the direct services. And that's what this chapter is about. Now, one thing I don't want anyone to get confused about, there are, as the screen shows, fixed and variable costs are the costs that are the volume driven from Chapter 5. Now, a fixed cost can be a direct or an indirect. A variable cost can be a direct or an indirect. And you've got the exact opposite relationship that's shown here. A direct cost can have a fixed or variable component, and an indirect cost can have a fixed and variable component. So the first two on the left, fixed and variable, are really Chapter 5, and the two on the right, direct and indirect, are Chapter 6. What are some examples of direct and indirect overhead costs, say for a hospital clinical laboratory? Well, let's see here. For direct costs, now this is in the lab itself, I would tell you that some of those direct costs would be the staff that work in that department or the supplies to give that actual service. So those are the direct costs related to the service. Those are the costs that are within that department and being charged directly to that department. Some indirect costs would be, let's say, the facility department has to come in and clean the lab every trash and do those kinds of things. The billing department needs to bill for the services. Now, those people don't work in the lab department, so those are the overhead or indirect costs. So now we should have a good idea of what is meant by a direct and an overhead cost. The purpose of cost allocation is to assign all overhead costs to the departments that create the need for such services, like our lab in the prior slide. Typically, we're talking about the patient service departments, like we talked the OR department or the ER department. To begin, we must define two terms used in cost allocation. Then we will illustrate two methods of cost allocation. The cost pool is the overhead amount to be allocated. So that's the cost of, let's say, the facility department that needs to be allocated to the lab for cleaning. All the costs of the facility department needs at one point or another to be, or some mechanism needs to be distributed and allocated to all the direct overhead, to all the direct departments. In general, a cost pool consists of the direct costs of one overhead department. Now, however, if the cost of a single overhead department differ substantially in nature and or use at different proportions, multiple cost pools can be created within one overhead department. A good example that they give here is the finance services department. Now, a lot of organizations, the finance department is also in charge of all the billing, and then they also have the normal financing job like budgeting and doing all kinds of other financial services. Well, because those two things are really very separate and different, you might want to allocate them differently. So you create a pool, two pools within one overhead department. Okay, we just want to make sure that we understand that's the kind of stuff that can happen when we talk about allocation. Okay, so that is the cost driver. The cost driver is the basis on which the cost pool will be allocated. So if we have all the overhead from one department, somehow we've got to distribute that cost to those departments, the direct departments. And and it's called a cost driver, is that method that we select to be able to do that. For example, the cost driver for facilities overhead, the building, space, the depreciation, the maintenance, the utilities, and so on, might be the amount of, so how do we distribute that? We might say, well, if every department, say the lab, they use 5,000 square feet to do their service, and we have 100,000 square feet that's in the whole facility, well, they would be allocated the total cost for the square footage for just those 5,000 square feet. Very simple, easy allocation. And we'll see later on that there are different ways and different things to do at different times and better ways to allocate costs. Selection of cost drivers is critical to the cost allocation process. And we're going to very soon get into some of the reasons why it is critical. Cost drivers should create an allocation that is highly correlated with the actual amount of overhead services consumed. So there has to be a relationship between the cost and how we're allocating the cost. You can't just do it willy-nilly. A good cost driver will have two important attributes. They should be perceived as being fair, and we'll talk about that, and they should promote organizational cost reduction. An example, we talked about the billing department and how we would allocate their costs and to make sure it's fair. Well, if we were just allocating it based on a driver, let's just say the number of people in each department, well, that's not a really good way to allocate the billing department's costs because there's not a good correlation. Also, if one department gets charged more than they feel is their fair share, it creates a lot of interesting conversations because what you're doing is a lot of times people are compensated or given bonuses based on how the whole department performs, and that includes their allocated overhead costs. So if they feel they're not getting a good allocation or a poor allocation of costs or being unfairly treated, it affects them personally, and people get very upset about that. And then they should promote organizational cost reduction. Well, that's a very interesting thing because what we're saying is they should be responsible for how much, or at least have some ability to impact how much of the overhead costs they actually are being charged. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Overhead cost allocation is a pain, but why is it necessary? Well, first let's talk about why it's a pain. Um, we've got all this cost that needs to be allocated. So it's a pain because, one, you've got to negotiate and figure out a way to fairly distribute or allocate those overhead costs. It's time consuming to do this. A lot of times you'll be doing it, and you'll find that people don't agree with the way it's being done. So it becomes, I guess, very painful. But why is it necessary? Well, unless we're allocating the cost properly to all the departments, it's very difficult to make sound business decisions. A lot of times, services, um, you'll find that how they're allocating the cost become very costly. And when you look at the number of costs that a department is having, and then you look at the value that it's giving to the organization, you have to determine if it's worth it. And so it's really a way to make sure that we're having proper, sound business decisions. Suppose a hospital uses amount of space occupied, that's square footage, like we talked earlier on in the lab, as the cost driver for the allocation of housekeeping services. Does this driver have the attributes of a good driver? Well, let's see. Um, what are the attributes of a good driver? Well, first, we said there has to be a correlation of the driver we select. And then that driver must be fair and promote cost reduction. So let's see if this is fair. Say we're talking about that lab again, and we want to charge the housekeeping services. Now we know in a hospital, um, every service has space, and we all know the amount of space in the whole hospital, or we can easily figure that out. And then we know how much space each department has. So we could easily take all the costs in the pool, which would be the housekeeping services, divide that by the total square footage of all the whole facility, and say, well, whatever that rate would give us how much we would apply to each of the departments. But is that a fair way to do it? Well, let's say you notice that the housekeeping services spent an awful lot of time cleaning up the ER room, spent an awful lot of time cleaning up the OR room. It only came into the lab every once in a while. And the lab actually had more space than, let's say, the OR room. But yet the OR room would be being charged less housekeeping services and the lab more housekeeping services, but yet the lab used less services. So that doesn't quite seem fair. Also, is that promoting any cost reduction? Is there any way that that manager in the lab can control the cost? Well, if it's by the amount of space, he or she really has no way to get more or less cost allocated because they don't have any control over the amount of square foot they use. I think a better way might be about trying to say the hours of service that are provided by the housekeeping service department to the whole hospital. Now, you know the number of hours that they serve in a year, and they know, or you could estimate, where the percent of their services go. So if a larger percent, more hours go to the OR or ER, then the lab area, they would be allocated and charged on an hourly rate. Now, that seems a little fairer because now the lab is only charged for what they're really using, and the OR is being charged more because they're using the service more. Also, it's a way when we talk about talks about ways to promote cost reduction. Each of the managers in every one of those departments, if they know they're getting allocated costs based on, like, it's almost like they're buying the service, they're going to do everything they can to make sure that they don't have to use as much as that service. They're going to figure out ways, just putting trash cans in the right place, or having ways to have employees clean up after themselves, not use that much service. That way, one, that helps the whole organization because they don't have to keep going and hiring and keeping high housekeeping costs that need to be allocated. And there is not that much housekeeping service being allocated to those departments. So that's a way to promote cost reduction. Now, identify the cost pool. Identify the cost pool, which is the dollar cost of the overhead activity to be allocated. We're going to talk about ways to actually illustrate. Assume the hospital's housekeeping department has direct costs of $100,000. We're actually going to calculate the rate and see how this would be done. The cost driver is the basis on which the overhead costs are to be allocated. Assume that the cost driver for housekeeping services is the amount of space occupied. Now, we just talked about that, saying that maybe not be a good idea, but they're going to run through this example just because of that, just to demonstrate how we would come up and apply and allocate overhead costs. Say, user departments in total occupy 200,000 square feet of space. The allocation rate is the numerical value used to make the allocation. So the allocation rate equals dollars in cost pool divided by total volume of cost pool. Here the allocation rate is $100,000 divided by the $200,000 of square feet, 200,000 square feet. That would give us 50 cents per square foot of space occupied. So let's see what happens. So we're saying total, every square foot would get 50 cents per square foot. And then all the costs, because remember, that $100,000 represents the cost pool, all the costs in that house cleaning department. Each user department is then allocated some portion of housekeeping overhead costs. Assume the critical care department occupies 10,000 square feet of space. Its allocation would be then 50 cents times 10,000 equals $5,000. So their overhead for the cleaning department, their cost being allocated to the critical care department would be $5,000, and that would be based on the square feet that they occupy. Well, this ends video 1 of Chapter 6, Cost Allocation. Now, I've also put on Moodle a self-test. I think there's 15 questions that you can go through, and they're good questions. I really recommend that you, after watching this video, go to that test and see how you do, and also make sure that you have read the chapter. Now, what we're going to do is there's going to be another video and then a third video, and also I'm going to try to put up a test, a self-test with each one of those. So good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.